In the movie Function Basics, I talked a little bit about arguments, and I want to talk to them in a separate video here to make sure that you understand some things about these, because they really can surprise you. So now let's talk just a little more about parameters and arguments when we're working with functions. First of all, the parameters define the arguments that can be accepted by a function. Now, if you remember that in the Function Basics video, I talked about how that parameters define the arguments, and then the arguments are the values that are passed to a function when it's called. Okay, so when I create a function, then I am going to include here the two arguments that I'm looking to accept when it gets called, and these are at this point parameters. So I've got two parameters here with add numbers, one integer that I'm calling x and one integer that I'm calling y. Now really all I'm defining here is that when you call this, I want you to pass me two integers of the type, or two variables or two values of the type integer, and I'm going to pass those in and use them. All right. And then the arguments are the numbers or the data that you include based on the data type in the parameters that you're going to use to call that. Now here's what I want you to really understand about this. This is pretty easy to get. But now when I'm passing the arguments to the parameters, the data types should match. Now what I really should say here is that data types must match. But the problem is that's not exactly true. Let's say that I've created a function, and the definition of that function declares that the parameters are integers, just like the example on the previous slide. Well, the arguments that I use to call that function should be integers. But now, what if they're not? What if I call it with a long? Or what if the parameters on the definition is a long data type, and then I call it with an integer? Well, here's what's going to happen. The compiler will look at these and say, well, you know what, I can convert that for them. I'll just take care of that for them. So the compiler will change the types. It'll convert the data types if it can. All right. It'll throw an error if it figures that it's too far apart. If it figures out that, hey, wait a minute, these two types, I really can't convert these without causing some serious problems here. And this can be dangerous, because if we have defined the parameters are integer and we pass it along and then it automatically converts it, well, it may drop some characters off the long when it becomes an integer, and now we've got a changed number that we didn't know anything about. That could be pretty hard to track down. So just keep in mind, this could be dangerous living here. All right. So anytime, if we're going like from a long to a short, anytime we're going to a smaller data type, this can be problematic. Now, make sure when you're working with arguments and parameters, you're very careful with this kind of stuff. Now we're going to talk about overloading a little bit later on, and we'll go a little bit deeper into this idea of arguments and parameters. But just make sure you kind of build brick by brick here and understand what's going on, what can happen to these things. And there's a lot of power here, but there's also a lot of potential issues you're going to have to deal with when you're dealing with arguments and parameters. Passing arguments is something you really need to understand to really be able to use C++ to your best advantage. Now there are a lot of things that are really cool about this. There are a lot of things that will surprise you. So let's go through this. Now, if you're not comfortable with the concept of passing arguments, I would strongly encourage you to go back and watch the video on the basics of functions. I think it was entitled Function Basics, because this is going to come back into play when we talk about function overloading, function prototypes, and all sorts of things. And so just kind of watch these videos, and if this is all new to you, just go a little bit at a time and get your head around it. Now when we pass arguments to functions, we're passing them really in two ways, or two methodologies. And what we're talking about here is how C++ handles the memory aspects of this whole operation in the background. We can either pass our arguments by value, or we can pass them by reference. Now let's go just a little deeper into this and talk about what these mean and how you can use them to your advantage. First of all, when we pass an argument by value, which by the way is the default in C++, and so if you don't do anything differently other than just mention your arguments in the definition of your function, then that's what you're doing. But when we pass by value, the arguments that you specify when you call the function really aren't sent to the function. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, the little men who live in C++ world and do all this work for you in the background, they take the arguments that you send to the function and they make a copy of these arguments, and then they use that copy inside the function. So while your function is running, any changes that your code makes to those arguments that you passed in are made to the copies that were passed, not to the original arguments that you called or that you passed when you called the function. All right? Hope I didn't lose you there. Listen to it a couple of times, make sure it makes sense to you. So that can be a problem. Well, there's a way around that. If you use a pointer as an argument, let me stop right here. If you're really new to all this stuff and you've now gone a little bit fuzzy on pointers, how you create them, how you use them, the asterisk, the ampersand sign, all that stuff, go back and watch the movies on pointers. What is a pointer, how a pointer works, all that stuff, all right? So go back and watch that, but once you get your head wrapped around pointers again, understand that if I use a pointer and pass by value, the pointer is actually pointing to the address of my original argument, all right? And then if I dereference that, dereferencing sounds really cool and techy. Just remember, it means that I'm using the asterisk, right? And if I dereference it, then that means I'm changing the value at that original address that got copied. So in essence, I'm actually changing my original argument. Really cool stuff. I'll show you a demo on that a little bit later on, all right? But now, pass by reference, this is the one you really need to watch, because pass by value will happen automatically. It can surprise you in the way those parameters are copied. But with pass by reference, the parameter acts as an alias for the argument being passed. Now, if you remember, an alias is simply another name for the same object. We're not copying anything. We're just creating a new name saying, hey, it's pointing to the same thing. It's very, very similar to a pointer. All right? This totally eliminates any copying of arguments, and you don't have to do any dereferencing with the asterisk to change the value or to see the underlying value. We're no longer worried about address or value. A reference is just an alias to the same object. Now, this becomes especially important when you begin to pass objects as arguments. Now, we haven't talked about objects in the course specifically yet. We're going to do that later when we talk about object-oriented programming, classes, objects, and all this sort of thing. But when you get to the point that you're passing arguments that are objects, you don't want to be copying those objects, because usually when we're passing an object as an argument, the object is pretty large, has a lot of state information about it, a lot of data, and so we can pass by reference and we can pass these large objects. No copying takes place, you know, and we can get a whole lot of really cool stuff done really quickly. So this whole idea of passing arguments can go a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper. Get your head around this much of it. Go work with functions, work with arguments, and then come back and watch this movie again later, and I think you'll get a little bit more useful information out of it, hopefully the second and third time around. Okay, so again, just digging a little bit deeper into this idea of passing arguments to functions. Now let's take a look at arguments in an example, and I want to use this example to first of all show you arguments in action in code. And then I also want to point out how passing arguments as values, or passing parameters as values, however you want to say that, how it really works and how it can confuse you. Now I'm going to build a purposefully confusing example here and show you how you can confuse yourself, but it also shows you what's really going on. Notice now I have created a solution here, a new project called arguments example. Then I've created a source file inside there, argx.cpp, and that's what we're coding in. And I've built these just like I have all the other examples in the course. You will find this arguments example in your work files folder or something very, very similar to this. And just go take a look at that and step through it and keep working through these simple examples to understand. And excuse me, I bumped the mouse there. Okay, now let's start off. We've got our include statement for IOStream, so we can do our cout and inline stuff. And then we're going to use our main function here. And notice I have already created some integers, x, y, and z. Now x is going to basically be used to get the answer. Y and z are going to be passed up to a separate function. Okay, so let's start off, and first of all let's create a function, and we'll create it outside the main obviously, and we'll return an integer, and we'll call it add this, and we'll take an integer n, integer y, and integer z. So that's what's going to be passed in, and then we will write the simple code. We're going to say z equals z plus 12. All right, now then we'll just return y plus z. All right, so basically we're going to take z, we're going to add 12 to whatever we pass in, then we're going to add y to that, so whatever we pass into y comes here, and then we'll return that back to something that calls it down here. All right, and then I will show you a little comment up there to help you understand it a little bit later. So what are we going to do here? First, well, we're going to let x equal, and notice x is equal to 0 right here. So we're going to say x equals, and we're going to call add this, and we're going to pass it y and z. All right, now pretty straightforward. So we're going to call add this, which means we're going to call this, and we're going to pass it y and z. Y is 4, z is 5. Y is going here, 4 here, and z is 5 right here. Now let's create some things to look at the results of what we get. And the first thing we'll do is we will say x equals, and we're just going to call add this y z, and I could have just as easily put x here. All right, and actually I'll just do that. How about that? Let's just put x there, and then we'll do a standard inline, and then to make it a little easier we'll do another standard inline. And I've got a bizarre something going on here. I went the wrong way, and so that'll take care of that one. And then let's just copy this so you don't have to watch me type over and over and over. We'll make this a little easier to read. We'll take a look at what y equals, and so we'll just put y here, and we'll remove one of our ends, and then we'll do the same thing here. And right here we will see what z equals. All right, and we will put z in here. All right, now the thing that I really want to show you is that when we call this, something very interesting is going to happen, and it's going to happen right here. Okay, and I'm just going to paste that in. This z, this right here, this statement is going to change the z that was passed in right here, which is not the same as the z that we sent from right here, because this z got up here, it made a copy of it, and this z right here that's 5 we never actually changed. Now how will we know that? When we look at this value right here, we will see the z that was here, and keep in mind we're talking about scope here, because this z is good within these two braces, and this z up here is good within these. Okay, so this z got sent up, a copy was made, this z stayed the same, this z was copied, went in, we manipulated that z. When we return y plus z to x here, you will see this z went in as 5, got added 12 to it, that's 17 plus 4, that should be around 21 if my math's right. So anyway, let's just run this, see if it'll compile up, see if I fat fingered anything here, and see if that actually works out. And again, I'll go out to Documents, I'll go to Visual Studio 2010, go to my projects, there's my arguments example. I'll right click on Debug, hold down the Shift key, open Command Window, and I'll call arguments example, and sure enough, that is exactly what has happened. Now let me pull this down so that you can see it, and let's talk about it. X equals 21, that is this line right here. Y plus Z. Now Y is still equal to 4 and Z is equal to 5 right here. Okay? Now notice this Z is equal to 5, but clearly we took the Z here and added 12 to it, so it should be 17. Alright, so look at this example in a quiet room away from the kids, dogs, TV, and everything, and you can see that this Z right here got copied up here, and we actually didn't change this. Now, had we passed by reference or we'd passed a pointer, we would have changed that. Alright, so that's just a quick example of passing arguments and what happens when these things get passed by value.